Hello and welcome to today's lesson on the space race. We're going to do two things today. We're going to identify the reasons why the space race occurred, and we're going to describe key events within the space race. Let's start off then with a definition of the space race. Now, the space race is a term used to describe the competition between the Soviet Union, that's the Russians, and the Americans between kind of the mid-1950s up until about 1975. Now, this was a race set in the Cold War context, and it wasn't a competition for like military might. This was a competition to get the best technology in order to go to space, allow space exploration, and ultimately to reach the moon. So, why was there a space race? Well, as I just mentioned, it's about competition. Now, the Cold War was a military competition. However, the two sides never actually fought a war, USA versus USSR. They always fought through intermediaries. So, for example, fighting through the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese, each side backing one of the two. Now, this meant that their competition spilled over into other spheres of life. And they were basically having a competition to prove who had the better way of living. Was it the Soviets through communism, or was it the Americans through capitalism? So it's always about this competition between communism and capitalism. Now, during the 1940s, both had developed nuclear weapons, so initially atomic bombs. For America, that's in 1945. It's what ends World War II in VJ Day, in Victory in Japan, with the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then the Soviets do this by 1949. Now, the thing with nuclear weapons is if you drop them, they will wipe out a huge number of people, like life all around that area, and they'll contaminate life close to the area. So neither side wanted to drop these nuclear weapons because effectively what you'd do is you'd wipe out that entire country, which you think, hey, that sounds great. The US could wipe out the USSR with one single bomb. The problem was that both sides had access to nuclear weapons. So they would both drop nuclear bombs, which would wipe out both them and their opponent. So they had this policy called mutually assured destruction. And it was basically the idea that neither of them would drop bombs because they knew that it would end with both sides just totally destroyed. So nuclear weapons were like the ultimate in weaponry at this time. But imagine if you were able to gain military superiority, be better than the other side in their army or in their weapons, by putting something into space. So, why was there a space race? Ultimately, it's about competition, but there's also this underlying tension that if one side was able to put a weapon into space, it would really threaten the other side. Now, the best way to think about the space race is perhaps to think of a kind of Olympics. It's not one single event that they're all trying to do, so they're not all trying to run the 100 metres, but it's rather like a series of small competitions, like doing the javelin and then doing the discus and then doing the 100 metres. So there's a whole series of small events that kind of collectively we call the space race. Now, the first mini race is the race to put a satellite into space. This is won by the Soviet Union, who in 1957 managed to launch this satellite called Sputnik. Now, this was the very first satellite. It was a huge propaganda success for the Soviets because it proved that Soviet technology was better than the Americans. Now, the Americans kind of had this assumption that, they were the best, and the Russians were stupid and backward and too poor to be able to achieve anything in space. So the fact that the Soviets are the first ones to win is a real blow to American pride. The Soviets then build upon this by being the first to put a living being into space. Now, obviously, you don't jump straight to a person. They first of all tested, could a living being survive in space by sending out a dog. So this is an image of Laika, who's the Soviet space dog. Now, Laika was just a stray picked up from Moscow, sent up into space. Unfortunately, Laika did not make the return journey, so survived the orbit, but the capsule overheated, and so Laika died on the return to Earth. However, Laika became a great Soviet hero. Again, this was a propaganda success because the Soviets had been able to do it before the Americans. Laika was loved in the Soviet Union. We can see some propaganda there on the right hand side. They even made a chocolate bar named after her. The importance of Laika is that it proved that you could send living beings into space. Now, you needed to do that before you could risk a human life. It wasn't just the Soviets who experimented by putting animals into space. These are Ham and Enos, the first two beings that the Americans put into space. They're the space chimps. Again, it is the Soviet Union who is the first to win another element of the space race. So we always think of Neil Armstrong as the ultimate astronaut, but he's not the first. The first man into space is actually Yuri Gagarin, and he's a Soviet cosmonaut. Now, cosmonaut is their word for an astronaut. He reached space in 1961. Now, this seems like it's the Soviet Union who at this moment are winning the space race. They were the first to put a satellite into space, first to put a living being in, and now the first to put a person into space. So in the early 1960s, it seemed like they were winning, and this was a great propaganda success for them. They had proven the abilities of Soviet science and technology. Here's some examples of the kind of propaganda that the Soviets were producing. As a result, the Americans felt they needed to step up their investment into space and into the space race. So in 1958, President Eisenhower ordered the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Administration. NASA came up with all kinds of ideas in order to win the space race and kind of win the propaganda story. One of them included sending a nuclear bomb to blow a chunk off the moon. It's President John F. Kennedy, or JFK, however, who's most remembered as the president associated with the space race. In 1962, he gave an important speech in which he pledged to get America to the moon. And he very famously said, Why do we choose to go to the moon? We choose to do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. So it's all about American aspirations to be the best and to prove they can do things even when they are extremely difficult. JFK did not live to see the first man on the moon. This happened in 1969 with the Apollo 11 mission. I'm sure you know the first word which was said on the moon here. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Those immortal words were uttered by Neil Armstrong, who was the first man to set foot on the moon. The rest of his crew included Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins. Now, it was kind of amazing that they managed to make it to the moon. If we look back at their technology, it's it's so much less than even like our phones today. They kind of went to the moon in sort of a tin rocket. It's really exceptional that they ever managed to make it there. In fact, the astronauts themselves didn't believe that they had that higher chance of success. Before they left, they signed lots of photographs of themselves so that their wives could sell them in case they didn't make it back. Then their wives would have been looked after for the rest of their lives from the money made. Now, we might see 1969 and the mission to the moon as the kind of ending of the um, rivalry or the kind of more hostile element of the space race. In the 1970s, we saw a lessening of Cold War tensions, which resulted in some joint ventures. For example, the Apollo Soyuz mission in 1975, in which the American and the Soviet capsule docked together in space. There we can see an image of the American astronauts and the Soviet cosmonauts doing a handshake in space. So this was a symbol of the two sides getting along a bit better during the mid 1970s in the Cold War. Now, so far, I've been very focused on the achievements of men and dogs and chimps. However, women also played an important part in the space race. On the American side, perhaps this is best shown through Katherine Johnson. Now, Katherine Johnson was one of NASA's computers. Now, a computer didn't mean a computer like we think of it today. A computer meant somebody whose job it was to do the computing, to do the maths. Now, she was an exceptional mathematician. She did all the maths needed to calculate the flights. Her achievements are made so much more extraordinary when you think about the fact that she was a black woman in very racist and very sexist 1960s America. And yet she was so necessary to the American space race. And of course, we can't forget Valentina Tereshkova, who was actually the first woman in space in 1963. She, of course, was a Russian cosmonaut. If you'd like to hear any more about the space race, I would really recommend listening to Homeschool's History's lesson on the space race. The link is there on the PowerPoint. It's in a red box, but you can just easily Google it and you'll find it on BBC Sounds.